And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you so much for joining us once again on a brand new guest, someone that I've had the privilege of meeting a number of times stateside. He, of course, host of American Thought Leaders and senior editor with Epoch Times. That is Jan Jekielek. Jan, thank you so much for your time today.
Peter, it's so great to be on. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you. And you, senior editor there with Epoch Times, fantastic location, just overlooking Capitol Hill. Of course, I traveled up with Dr. Robert Malone into DC for Fallout, which was the show that you did many things, including horse riding, going to a farm. It was great fun, and you got to really meet the person, a different type of, I think, show and interview. But your career spanned academia, international human rights, and probably now in 2 decades in the media. And we'll get into all of that, but could maybe step back a little bit. Epoch Times. Um, Epoch Times started, I think, 25 years ago, and website. But actually, when I traveled, I think 2 years ago, I was in Fairfax and saw the newspaper sitting on a friend's table, and I thought, no way, is this in a paper format? And I had no idea as a Brit that this was available as a newspaper. But tell us a little bit about how Epoch Times started, those growing, and then we'll get into a little bit later of how you joined them.
Absolutely. Well, it's actually quite funny. We actually started as a website 25 years ago, and the newspaper came later. Um, but no, so we were actually started by Chinese Americans in Atlanta, Georgia. And it's quite an interesting story. Our founding CEO, he had been in the student movement in 1989. And as a number of these students that basically survived the Tiananmen Square massacre and the movements in the other cities, they when they could, they were bright enough. They got scholarships to other places in the world, notably in the U.S. And John Tong, he went to Georgia Tech on a scholarship, theoretical physicist. And then when 1999 rolled around, and that's when the Chinese regime turned on the Falun Gong, with the purpose of eradicating the group, to use the words of the dictator at the time. A few of these students at Georgia Tech thought to themselves, "Hey, there's a First Amendment here. We can actually tell the true story of these people and counter this massive propaganda campaign that's being run to demonize them, to kind of justify, eradicating the group, so to speak." So, I mean, it was basically born as an answer to Chinese government propaganda, Chinese Communist Party propaganda, and it started in Chinese language in Atlanta, and it very, very quickly, within a few years, they kind of decided, hey, wait a sec, I think we need this in English too, because there's all these Western media that are actually just taking the Chinese Communist Party talking points and publishing them as if they're like credible information, right? And you have to remember, this was a very different time than today. Today, we have a much better understanding of the realities of communist China. I think Epoch Times is actually, in significant part, responsible for that. But back then, there were people were imagining that if it was Kissinger doctrine, people are imagining if you pump enough money into China, they're going to kind of become like us, become a democracy, right? And of course, this was a whole sort of plan of subterfuge and so forth, but people deeply believed it. I remember, and you mentioned I was in human rights. I was talking to people about some of the, things which are almost unimaginable to Canadians and Canadian and Americans, and they would just didn't want to hear it. They just thought I was a crazy man, right? And so it it was the first media that was really trying to cover these issues in a very kind of honest way, and I think a measured way, considering the extent, the extreme nature of the human rights violations in China at the time.
Tell us a little bit about how that growth was. It's not starting from scratch. It's near on impossible. I did Epoch Times have done that and established themselves with a huge presence in the US and internationally. But maybe let us know a little bit about those growing pains, the difficulty Epoch Times faced as it grew to be where it is now.
Gosh, there were many, many growing pains. I mean, so it started in Chinese language about China. right? And then it kind of grew into covering the Chinese communities in the US and frankly in many, many cities around the world. I'll just add, I'm not going to talk so much about these other editions, but we're actually in 22 languages around the world. A lot of people don't know that. But the original was Chinese, but very quickly English became the second language it started in, and then started covering a much broader section of information, not just focused on China, which was, I guess, the initial purpose. And so, I guess in the initial years, it wasn't. I don't know if it would be so markedly different from a lot of what you would see in the mainstream media, aside of the issue of China, where there was just this weird credulity, and of course, the Chinese regime was using. Essentially, it's a leverage, right, for journalists that were in China. They would just say, well, if you cover these, these are untouchable points, or you can only kind of cover them in the way that we like. Otherwise, you're never going to come back, right? They use the visas as a weapon. And indeed, I remember this is something we could talk about a little more. But for example, in 2001, the New York Times was blocked in China for having done some coverage which the regime didn't like. And basically the publisher himself went with like a whole group of people in tow to Beijing, interviewed Jiang Zemin, the dictator at the time, personally. You can look up the interview on the website. And since that time, for example, we've noticed that the coverage is a little bit different. Also, so it's very difficult to be fair to do reporting there because you have to play ball, and there's just some things the Chinese regime doesn't want talked about, and those were all the things that Epoch Times was kind of started to write about in particular, right? um
I
Go ahead.
want to get on the China narrative, but I want to. You've moved to a subscription model. It's like $1 to sign up to, but tell us how that is, because the difficulty of a media outlet actually generating income to actually run. And you moved to a subscription model, which is accessible more or less to everyone. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, at some point, the English edition became kind of the dominant edition. I want to mention this too, that we actually use some of the best firewall busting software. The Chinese internet is kind of isolated with something that's dubbed the Great Firewall of China. So our Chinese edition cuts through that with some amazing software called FreeGate and another one called UltraCert. These are the most reliable. And so that it's getting that information like a Voice of America or Radio Free Asia into China, and allowing people to surf the internet normally. So that all is happening. But on the other hand, right, this is where I've been involved in the English edition. That edition has grown kind of in different spurts. Okay, and one of the huge challenges, and since you're talking about the business aspect, one of the huge aspects problems has been that the Chinese regime really didn't like what we were doing because we were exposing them, right? And all the way along from the beginning, they'd set up all sorts of barriers. Like I've actually been on sales calls, right, with salespeople where whenever you were trying to make a sales call to a larger corporation, you would say, for example, oh, I've got the great market, I've got I've got great access, and they're like, yeah, you've got everything I want actually for my ad. And then you would have to tell them, and this is what they figured out with a little bit of time. If you do sign this deal with us, it's quite possible that someone claiming to represent the Chinese government or be affiliated with the Chinese government will come to you and say, don't work with this media because you'll hurt. This is the euphemism they use. You'll hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. This is how the Chinese regime imagines itself as kind of the voice of the Chinese people, which of course nothing could be further from the truth. But and of course, in most companies, you can imagine, right? Do you want the exposure of having like communist China not like you? Who would make that deal, right? Nonetheless, people still did make the deals, but it was a lot rarer than if you had a normal business. Okay, I'm trying to kind of paint a picture for you of what we've had to kind of endure, and we came up with all sorts of interesting ways. There was one point we really invested heavily in Facebook. And this is interesting because of Mark Zuckerberg's, recent announcement, right? That he's kind of going back on the censorship. this is extremely welcome news, right? But at one point, across all our properties, we were doing something like 1 billion video views a month, right? To give you a picture of how invested we are in Facebook, how big our activity there was, and how popular it was, and the approach was actually all ad oriented using Facebook ads, right? So it was a very big part of the business, and it was only after we actually started encountering some other kinds of interference, right? There were some hit pieces, notably one written by NBC, I think in 2018, that dubbed us. Let's just say I'm not going to repeat their language, but they basically said our advertising was political advertising that would benefit the Trump campaign, right? Where you could transparently, and this is in a database, right? You can actually look at it and you can see patently that there's subscription ads. But what happened was, when these articles were published, that basically created a situation where Facebook immediately, basically upon these articles being published, didn't allow us to do that anymore, right? Which of course was a huge. It was the way that we were marketing the Epoch Times, right, to the world, to people, and so we had to, scramble to change our business model. And you can imagine what that looks like. It was already pretty sizable. So these are growing pains. It turns out that it's not just false narratives of the Chinese regime that need to be countered with truthful information. And so, as many people watching this channel will know, back in 2015 and 2016, this narrative developed that President Trump was a Russian agent, an actual asset, right? And of course, this is a preposterous idea on the face of it, and very easy to do a bit of research, which we did, that would show that this is extremely unlikely and there's really no evidence for it, and it's kind of a narrative. And so when we started publishing this way, that we got a lot of attacks all of a sudden from actually not just the Chinese regime, but Western what I now call legacy media, which is the whole thing was just kind of shocking because actually I remember very distinctly, like all of us have had these kind of, we call them red pill moments, right? Or like this aha moment, something's not going as I imagined it, right? Well, for me it was right around this issue. It was Trump Russia collusion. That was the language that was used, right, all the time. And it just all of a sudden and it was really all of a sudden these legacy media all are basically speaking like out of the same talking points playbook. And the reason I noticed it is because I'm used to studying the Chinese media, right, and following them, because I came from this background of China human rights, watching it, looking at translations. I don't speak Chinese, but and it just really reminded me of that, and it was like boom. And I thought to myself, how is this even possible? Are they coordinating? Like what is this, right? And of course we had a different story to tell, because the narrative was, as I said, ridiculous very quickly, with a little bit of cursory research on his face. It turned out we needed to do a whole lot of incredibly in-depth work to follow something that had went on for years, right? This
Well,
narrative kept being pushed out.
well,
Yeah.
let's touch on that. We'll touch on the legacy media in a moment, but yeah, that focus, you shifting the narrative on China, um, decades before it was popular. We all know the stories about Chinese collusion, Chinese infiltration in many aspects of society. You were talking about this long before. What was it like for kind of Epoch Times to be out there on a ledge talking about something that maybe wasn't so popular?
It was very difficult, and even among a lot of China hands, um, we were kind of attacked, which I mean, not everybody, right? But I think it had to do with access, right? I think people needed to sort of performatively, make sure they ingratiated themselves at some level to the regime to get access. And it's a complicated relationship, and I do understand that. But we for example exposed the United Front I believe for the first time, which is a huge. I mean, this is a today it's something to the tune of $20 billion a year spent on influence operations overseas, right? It's like very serious work, co-opting politicians, basically making sure Chinese communities follow the party line. You've heard about these police stations, police stations in quotes. That's it all comes out of that. All of these different overseas influence operations. And as our reporter Josh Phillip was actually in the Chinatowns trying to do this work, he inadvertently uncovered this, right? Because he was being, people were trying to assault him in some cases, right? Because they didn't like what he was writing, right? So the reaction was varied. I do have to say there were quite a few people who have been, I'm thinking about someone that I believe Gordon Chang,
I know of him,
very
yes. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, Gordon Chang very early on, became someone who really appreciated the Epoch Times from the beginning because he saw that there was this sort of genuine effort to try to get at the truth of the reality of China, which he understood from his own work, from his own work there. So yeah, it was a mixed bag, but it also made us public enemy number one of a regime which grew into basically the largest and most ferocious and dangerous, unfortunately, totalitarian regime in the world right now. And frankly, what I view as the only real strategic threat to America. Um, yeah,
Yeah, you made yourself an enemy of the CCP and also of different administrations in the US, but we'll touch on that in a bit. But what about you? How do you end up joining Epoch Times? You've got a very varied background. How did you end up getting involved in media in Epoch Times?
it's a it's a bit of a story. So back in the day, I was actually a biologist, studying to be a biologist. I worked in Madagascar. I studied lemurs. This was at a time when the Madagascar films I don't think had come out yet, and a lot of people didn't know what lemurs were. After the films, people knew. That's what I remember. But no, and that it was fantastic work. It actually gave me huge opened my eyes to a lot of the let's call it international realities in the world. I grew up in Canada and different parts of Canada. I didn't. It really changed my thinking quite a bit. But I was very happy, pursuing my doctorate in biology, and I ended up getting stricken. I think through some a parasitic worm infection, these types of things, with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And Guillain-Barré syndrome is like people have heard of it, perhaps during the pandemic, because it was one of the rare side effects of one or more of these genetic vaccines that were used for COVID. But what people had never heard of it, very rare. Basically, your immune system goes haywire because of some kind of shock to it and attacks your peripheral nervous system. And what the effect of that was, it killed my career. Okay, and we're talking 1999 here. And yeah, I met a guy who had chronic fatigue syndrome. He told me he had helped himself using this ancient Chinese meditation. I tried it off a VCD. Remember, there used to be these things called VCDs, low quality DVDs. And it made me. I was doing these exercises a bit like Tai Chi, slow motion, and I felt better. And within a few months, I went and saw my neurologist again. We had this arrangement that I would, come in periodically if things got really bad. Of course, I'd check myself into the hospital again. But she told me that I was basically in complete remission, and she doesn't need to see me anymore. So it was it was a profound experience, right? And I didn't know anything about communist China at this point. And of course, the meditation, by the way, was Falun Gong, and I didn't know that people were being persecuted. I didn't know about any of this. And I learned as I was trying to figure out what it was that I was doing that was actually having this, very, noticeable impact in helping me. Um, yeah, this is, there was a
When was
woman,
this? When was this kind of you having that and connect with Madagascar? What year was that?
so I had just come back, I think in 98, the last time. And
Mm.
this is 1999. And then on to 2000. So what's really interesting is this is at exactly the time where this Falun Gong persecution is initiated by Jiang Zemin. Almost at the same time, I'm getting ill and learning about this and healing myself. Um, and there was at the university, there was a postdoc whose mother had escaped from China, and I remember her telling me, using her daughter as a translator, that basically, if she was gonna, if she would sign a piece of paper, she could go, she could leave. She had been arrested, but if she didn't sign the piece of paper, they were going to use increasingly more they were going to basically force her to do it, and torture was one of the methods that they ended up using on her because she refused, and in the end she actually survived and made it out without having signed these things. But the whole thing, it sounds so weird, right? When you think about it, to someone growing up in Canada in the 80s, one of the most perhaps the freest societies in the history of the world, it really sounds really weird, right? To hear, well, you're in jail, for something incredibly serious. On the other hand, if you just sign a piece of paper, you can go home. There's no justice here, right? Now, obviously, there's something wrong, and I'll never ever forget this moment. It actually it runs shivers down my spine every time I think about it. My parents had escaped from communist Poland, and they taught me all these things. And of course, I knew communism is bad, right? But I didn't really get it. And this whole interaction with this woman, I'm getting the shivers on my spine talking about it right now. I suddenly just got it in this. Understood a lot of the crazy behaviors my parents had, very protective. It's okay. That's a whole nother story. But I said, okay, this is this system. I understand what this is now, and I need to help. I need to help these people, right? And that's actually what got me into the human rights side of things.
Um, it's in it's you describe your medical condition. I know someone exactly the same medical condition, exactly the same country, exactly the same animals you're working with, and exactly the same time. So we'll have to have a talk about that offline
Are
because
you serious?
it could be
That's
that we know
wild.
exactly the same person, but that's weird. That would be a conspiracy theory, Jan. So let's talk
Uh-huh.
after. But
Uh-huh.
you d the narrative and the fight you have with the CCP, you've had with Epoch Times, many other stances that have been unpopular. One is, of course, with the vaccines, and you've held your line. You've been factual. You've been informative. You put forward a position, and that's what the media should do, and not capitulate to advertisers, which you don't seem to have done. But tell us what that was like. Another battle, which was on the vaccine, extremely vocal. And of course, you mentioned the shows you've done with Dr. Robert Malone later on. But what was that like? Fighting up against a government, an industry that actually says, no, you need to go one way and you want to go a different way. And that has repercussions in America, not just, of course, over in China and the CCP. But tell us about that battle, about trying to get the truth out about vaccines.
Well, here's the interesting thing about this, and of course, we're talking about the COVID, genetic vaccines that that's what you're referencing.
Yeah.
Actually, I was just started reading this grand jury report from Florida that Governor Ron DeSantis commissioned some years ago on exactly this issue, and it's kind of, I guess, in a way auspicious that this has come out kind of as we're recording the other day, because I don't even see us as having really taken a stance. I for me it was more, again, things weren't adding up, right? And I was talking to people who seemed to their information seemed to add up. It actually started with, I was very curious about why Ron DeSantis had taken the approach that he had in Florida compared to other places. It did seemed weird, right? But it's also seemed to be effective. So the question was like, why? Why are you doing this, right? And I actually did a whole documentary with him, DeSantis, Florida versus lockdowns, which I mean, I'm very, very happy to have done that. somewhere in the middle of the pandemic. But what that did was it exposed me to all sorts of people. He said, "Well, let me introduce you to my advisors," right? And notably, one of them was Jay Bhattacharya, now nominated for NIH director, Scott Atlas. There were others, and I mean, it really opened up my mind. These were the most credible of credible scientists, right? Who were just saying things that were. Initially, it was very difficult to believe. Like, why is everybody have or all these people have this one position, and there's these few people out there that have a different one. But I luckily I have this background in actually in evolutionary biology. I've read a lot of scientific papers in biology and genetics. Not so much in virology necessarily, but it helped me it meant that I could read the papers and actually understand them a lot faster than say the typical layperson, right? And yeah, so I mean, we also we're looking this the we also had this situation where, remember, there was this narrative early on in the pandemic that it has to be a natural origin, right? And there was this letter that was written in one of the Nature subjournals, which was, for me, it would have been like my career is made for having published here in these, in Nature as a biologist. And the paper, basically said there's no way it's a lab origin. It's natural, and it was, patently any third year, biology genetics student would have known that that's a ridiculous proposition at its face. I was shocked that Nature had published this, right? I don't even know if it's been retracted yet, right? Of course, there's been a lot more research done over the time. We had a documentary that we put out, very early in the pandemic that we got in a lot of trouble for around this issue. Again, and we didn't really say anything definitive in it. We just said, look, there's this kind of evidence points in a particular direction, right? And that's really I think that's what journalism is supposed to be. You know, um, we did learn that these vaccines are problematic, and that the due diligence wasn't done, that there appeared to be kind of side effects that are being downplayed. I mean, there's all this stuff. It just sort of evolved. There's this whole suite of people. One of the most moving things for me was encountering people who had been actually in the clinical trials themselves and then got injured and then were just sort of ignored afterwards. It was horrible, right? Because it turned out that this is actually treatable, that these conditions, when the injuries are relatively rare, right? But the point is, when they happen, you want to treat the people that they're happening to well, right? And that wasn't happening. So um yeah, of course, having a different narrative again than the legacy than the legacy media, it was problematic. But we had actually switched. We were forced, as I suggested to you earlier, we were forced to switch to a subscription model, right? And we grew quite a bit over the years on around these issues, because it turned out there's this people had a thirst for the truth, whether it was about China, whether it was about health. Actually, health, this is what's curious, our health section has actually been our most successful section all along, right? Where we have traditional Chinese medicine, we have a lot. It's not your typical health section. And just people flocked to us because I think part of it was just they saw that a lot of these mainstream or legacy media narratives were just kind of obviously not true, right? And you kind of wonder, you have to go somewhere else to figure out what's true. And we were one of those places that was at least trying, right, to do that, to figure it out. I mean, it's very complicated working in an environment like that, right?
Yeah, and it was in the Trump administration. I remember looking at different media outlets and using Breitbart a lot, and then you see Epoch Times seemingly more in depth on these issues. What was that like, that battle? But I guess being the plucky understart to actually then growing and being really should be at the same table as the legacy media, but the legacy media obviously saw you as a huge threat. What was that like? That, I guess, the attacks. I mean, you just read your Wikipedia page. I mean, you're the most extremist, awful, far right, blah blah blah, whatever entity. What was that like battling against legacy media?
I'll just comment. One of my earlier guests some years ago was Larry Sanger, one of the co-founders of Wikipedia, and we were talking about that, like what had happened to Wikipedia and how it's not really. It's still, I think it's still reliable on things that are non-controversial, largely because, but the moment it becomes like a politicized issue or there's an ideological bent, unfortunately, and the former head of Wikimedia, she said it herself. Truth kind of gets in the way sometimes. I mean, that's my paraphrase, okay, of what she said. But that's nuts. Like you can't have a website like that, right? It was very difficult because, listen, here's the thing, right? We were founded to give truthful information to people that don't have it or don't already believe it. So we've grown substantially over however many, the last decade, right? Something like that. But now we're in this situation where there's a whole bunch of people that kind of believe these things that are on Wikipedia, as insane as they really are. But actually, those are the people that we're most interested in talking to, right? Because there's a lot of people that already understand. There's a lot of other media that have kind of come up and started covering these issues that we pioneered, on. And now what's on my mind all the time is how do we reach those people that are still kind of caught up in this weird uh, propaganda information ecosystem, right? Whether it's from China or legacy media or someone else. Um, the answer is it's very hard, but on the other hand, it's kind of what we've been doing all along, right? So it's I guess less hard, and it's just kind of been our thing to have big actors after us in various ways, and and just sort of rising to the occasion and just sticking to the truth irrespective.
I mean, has part of it been that subscription model? Because obviously a lot of media struggle with advertising, and that can be a way of taking down your competitor, I guess, saying they're spreading misinformation and therefore making advertisers afraid. But the subscription model, it's slightly different, and you have people who buy in, I guess, and are part of it. So you build a community, which doesn't really happen outside that model.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's pros and cons to that, and we're 95% funded by our individual subscribers. With some, we're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, by the way, for those watching. But we view I'm not going to give exact numbers, but quite a bit more than 1 million individual subscribers as our lifeblood. We can't be grateful enough because that allows us two things. It gives us a lot of independence, right? Every model has its problems, whether it's advertising or a few big donors, or I think the tons of small donors, which is how we view the model, is probably the best in being able to stay independent. But it's also not foolproof, and I'll explain why. And there's a great scholar at the Manhattan Institute who talks about this quite a bit, and I think very effectively. What happens is these days people don't pay to be informed; they pay to have their beliefs validated. This is the assertion he makes, and I've come to accept his view, right? And so what happens then is that, and you can imagine, right? Oh, you have a lot of media, even media that are, that actually are quite truthful. Nonetheless, their marketing teams are, their job is to deliver subscriptions or, deliver those advertising dollar impressions or so forth. So they're taking the things that will validate the views of people, and that, because that's how they're going to convert, that's how they're going to make money in your market. So you kind of, what the effect of that is, the audience kind of pulls you with them, right? Because your marketing teams need to deliver, right? And and the problem with that is, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, if you're trying to reach for the people that don't already agree, right, who don't already believe these things, then it makes it very hard. And that's our situation right now. We're trying to figure out how to do that most effectively. Like, for example, the 10 million Democrats that voted for Trump in the 2020, sorry, in the 2024 election, right? Those people, from the research we've seen, they didn't vote for Trump because they agree with his entire agenda. They just didn't like the other option, right? Or mostly, and some of them are very worried about what's coming, right? And so there's an opportunity to try to just explain these things again, for better or for worse, fairly, right? And but how do you reach the people that have come to believe that again, I'm not going to use the slurs, but something that they shouldn't be reading.
Yeah, and it could have been 10 million voted in 2020, but not that. That's a whole other conversation. We'll not get into that. Um, eh, tell us about American thought leaders. It's kind of gained a
Mhm,
life of its own.
mhm.
And just look, I mean, you back catalogue of a thousand odd interviews, and some of your recent ones that the audience will know well. I think whether it's a UK audience or whether it's the War Room Posse watching stateside, but you've General Flynn, Carrie Lake, Senator Ron Johnson, Dr. Drew, Seb Gorka, Jay Bhattacharya, and the list goes on. Tell us a little bit about that, because these are it. I love talking with individuals who have got such expertise in an area, and have driven the agenda or spoken truth or made things happen within their sector. And you've got so many of those. But what has it been like over the time to engage with so many of those leaders and actually understand a little bit more about what makes them work?
Uh, it makes me have the best job in the world. I mean so I'm one of these people that could have been a lifelong student, okay? I love learning, right? And so this show, we started in January of 2019. Now we're, 1,100 plus interviews in. um, has been just the education of a lifetime for me. I mean, I it's like I live for it. I've done various things with the media over the years, but it's sort of my life has shifted into doing more and more of that because partially because I loved it so much. And partially because the audience did too, thankfully. The combination that works is the best, right? Um, no, and I mean, I've had my assumptions. This is what's funny. I think the tagline that we have is deep dive interviews that challenge assumptions, right? And I've had my assumptions challenged a lot over these years. Yeah, I mean, it's almost hard to give you kind of a succinct answer, but I think it's been, the best job I could hope for given my particular, disposition and interests. And I also think that in many cases, I've been able to give a voice to some people who really deserved it, right? But were somehow being, suppressed again because of particular, legacy media narratives or, societal narratives that were just turned out to be quite far from reality.
Have you had an American thought leader on Madagascar or lemurs yet?
You know what? I haven't, but recently in DC, I went to an event which had basically every embassy had a kind of display, and I met the Malagasy embassy people, and we talked a little bit. They gave me some vanilla, of course, because this is one of the few exports that's kind of very international. And I hope I will do that soon, but I'm gonna have to think a little bit about what to do with them. Yeah.
One guest we had on, and Jan, it was from talking to you earlier, was Levi Browd, and he talked about Falun Gong, and as I mean, there are many ways the CCP attack. They attack Christians, they attack Falun Gong, and they attack anyone that doesn't fit in with their model. But you've kind of been in the crosshairs of that fight with the CCP. Maybe let us know a little bit. We've touched on China and the tax on the CCP, and something that happens to me behind the scenes. The public aren't necessarily aware of those fights. You talk about the firewalls you have and the protection, but this kind of engagement and um, I mean Falun Gong. Surely they should have the right to operate as a movement, and yet they seem to be a threat to the CCP. But how have you seen being involved in that fight?
Oh, this is a great question. Well, the thing to understand about the Chinese regime, right, is that it is right is people that expose that in various ways. And this is one of the reasons why Christians, for example, a lot of people are becoming Christian in China these days, and there's increased persecution of Christians. Why? Because it's giving people the thing that the CCP can't give them, right? Which is, meaning, connection with God. I don't know how people think about it, but that's people will be familiar with that reality. Um, Falun Gong, of course, provides that as well for people. You know, it's for those that aren't as familiar. It's a religion. It's based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. These are the key tenets. It's very unusual in how it's structured. There isn't a hierarchy. There's a master or a teacher. You can actually use both words interchangeably, but he's not the boss, or there's no worship in it, and it's actually incredibly self-directed. So that there's voluminous teachings, but the onus is on the individual practitioner to understand them and implement them as they see fit. And the other thing that's, there's a few kind of rules that probably all practitioners would agree on. One of them is there isn't worship, there isn't collection of money, and there's never coercion. This is something, or even sort of, I guess you would call it evangelicism in the Christian context. It doesn't work like that. So the impact of this in the Chinese context is massive, right? You have, by the end of 1999, there were, by government estimates, 70 to 100 million practitioners of Falun Gong in China, right? There were 10,000 practice sites, and people would just gather in the parks to practice this sort of thing, basically spontaneously, right? There were 10,000 of those types in Beijing alone at the time. And when the regime cracked down on it, people ask, well, why was that? Well, it was bigger than the Communist Party. Yes, it seemed bigger than the Communist Party. The thing that occurred to me subsequently is just this very unusual grassroots nature, right? Is kind of something that the CCP could never control, actually. Right. And I kind of, I can see why they view it as this particular existential threat. As we actually got insider information not too long ago from a Chinese dissident who's in Australia, who has maintained various contacts within the Chinese government, that Xi Jinping himself in 2022 elevated the destruction of Falun Gong, especially overseas, to the Minister of State Security level. And which basically it means that you have I don't know if you mentioned Shen Yun earlier, but there's this huge dance performance that basically dances to 1 million people across the world every year. That's actually a homegrown operation in America. Started in 2006, has been incredibly successful. But one of the things it does is it explains to people that all the great things, contrary to the Chinese regime's propaganda, all the great things of China actually come from Chinese tradition, right? And it's not from the regime, right? It's a celebration of China before communism, and also exposes some of the regime's atrocities. That's one side, right? Another side, and this is, I mentioned that Epoch Times has been persecuted, right, by the regime all the way from the beginning. They kind of they view Epoch Times as something, as a kind of an arm of Falun Gong, right? Even though it's independent, but founded by Falun Gong practitioners. And I would like to say influenced by that first principle, truthfulness. I actually think that's one of the things that has helped us stay true all along. Um, uh, we've of course published a lot on the Falun Gong persecution, a lot more than I think most other media. And as this understanding of the CCP being what it really is, right, which is like basically always acting in bad faith, you know, and it murdering millions upon millions of its people in various campaigns, the human rights violations, the bad faith, it's the way it leverages international institutions, the monetary system against the US, the technology theft. I mean, I could go on and on and on. They really don't like Epoch Times, right? Uh, and there's a third dimension that I like to mention, and I've talked about this with you before quite a bit. There's this whole organ harvesting regime which we exposed also around 2006, where there's a, I call it a murder for organs industry in China, described by one of the researchers who first sort of established it was real as a evil yet to be seen on this planet. People, you can go to China in 2 weeks and get an organ of choice for the right amount of money. It's a multi-billion-dollar annual industry, and there's actually a survivor of it, which is I never thought we'd ever see. And in the last few months, there's been more press on this than there has been in the last 18 years that I've been following the issue. right? So this is something we could perhaps we could talk about more. But let's just say this is one thing the regime really doesn't want the world to understand as a reality, because it's like, it's like, I'll take your crimes against humanity and I'll take you further, or something. It's really astonishing. So this, I think, this whole, confluence of the regime being revealed for what it is through the efforts of Falun Gong practitioners, through the efforts of Epoch Times, through just this astonishing survival of an organ harvesting survivor who was rescued, by the way, by the Trump 45 Assistant Secretary of State, Bob Destro. I like to mention that because it was a lot of hard work to rescue that guy safely to America. And now he's in peril, right? People have raided his house. He's getting death threats. They're trying to lure him back there. Um, what I'm trying to say is that um, basically it's kind of a no holds barred, right? And on when it comes to Shenyun, they're being lawfared. I mean, it's kind of astonishing, right? There's a lawsuit that came out of Taiwan from a woman who was a dancer at Shenyun at one point, and she ended up becoming affiliated with the Beijing Dance Academy, which is the only kind of real. If there is a competitor to Shenyun, it might be that doesn't do nearly as well, but it's controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, right? And this was someone who was, based on our own receipts, very, very positive to Shenyun over years, got married. Maybe she was leveraged. How does it work in China? Well, they threaten your family, right? They have all sorts of ways to leverage people. I don't know what happened there, right? What I do know is that um, you know there's this incredible volunteer effort and growth of a dance performance company when a lot of other media are actually, or a lot of other uh, enterprises of this nature are actually declining, without taking external funding. It's an incredible success story. And now you have the New York Times painting it in this obsessive way, 9 articles over 5 months, as some as somehow exploitative of the dancers. I mean, the thing is, it's again a narrative that's preposterous on its face, weaved in a very intricate way by the New York Times. But New York Times has been uh, you know attacking us for a very long time, and frankly hasn't been publishing very honestly on Falun Gong since 2001. So the reason I'm talking about the New York Times right now is that this reporting actually speaks to two of these vectors of attack which the Chinese regime in these disclosures outlined, which is lawfare and leveraging Western media. Um, in a nutshell, right, you have this lawsuit with multiple big law firms supporting it. It's being set up against Shenyun, and you have the New York Times reporting on, you know, basically missing the big story of a massive persecution happening in China, and this, perhaps the largest civil disobedience movement in history in response, and focusing on these minutia. There's been actually someone in the US who has been indicted and found guilty of trying to bribe the IRS to remove Shenyun's tax exempt status. So even the US government is aware of this. There's been other environmental lawsuits against Shenyun that have been basically more recently dismissed with prejudice because someone kept filing them basically to harass them. All of this is the reality. And of course, we ourselves are being hit pieced, so to speak, by the New York Times. So, I mean, I'm just trying to kind of paint a picture for you of how the CCP operates. And it's unimaginable to me with their $20 billion estimated budget for the United Front that a substantial part of those resources isn't being kind of used to influence these all of these particular realities.
We touched on that with Levi and the whole organ harvesting, a huge issue, and something I begun to become aware a couple of years ago, and maybe we'll be able to go into that in depth another time because it is horrendous. But I can't let you go without just asking you about President Trump. We're in a different time than we were in 2016. So where does Epoch Times fit in with a Trump presidency?
Well, that I mean, this is a great question, right? As it would happen, I've had, quite a number of the nominees for cabinet positions on the show in the past among those 1,100 interviews. Um, well, I'll mention this, right? A number of them I can say, I've gotten to know reasonably well, and I can say they're people of good character. And this is great information to know, right? At the outset, because at least people will be acting in good faith, and trying to elicit positive change, and I would like to tell those stories, right? For better or for worse. And I also think in many cases they're people that, if they're wrong, they're going to be happy to change course, so that it kind of creates a wonderful opportunity in a way for a media like ours, because I feel like, there's this huge kind of brewing tribalism, right? And certainly in America, and I think in every Western country, right? In Canada, and my country, and in the US as well. And there's it's almost like this expectation that if you're backing this horse, you can only say positive things. If you're backing this horse, you can only say the reality is complicated, right? People aren't right all the time. And of course, people can be very unhappy if you write about the fact that they're not right. But I think in this administration, at least the sense that I get is that covering it fairly, they'll be very happy with that, right? And it can be this kind of back and forth that the fifth estate is actually supposed to have, right? And influence, and kind of influence, what government does by doing this, truthful reporting. So I'm very excited about it, frankly. um,
It's going to be a wild ride with probably the most revolutionary administration any of us have ever known. So it's buckle up, I think is the term.
mhm.
Jan, thank you so much for coming on. I love what you do with American Thought Leaders, Epoch Times. If people are not subscribed, they need to. The guy was like 80 cents a week or something. I signed up. I don't know what it is now, but it's certainly very, very accessible. And the amount of shows and programs, information you put out is phenomenal for that price for a cup of coffee. Probably cheaper than a cup of coffee in the US. But thank you, Jan, for coming on and sharing some of your experience of how Epoch Times has grown and the current political climate. Thank you.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Yeah, taking me down memory lane a little here. Thanks a lot, Peter.